The Veth Plateau is not a place that wants you to understand it. I had been on survey worlds before, 9 of them by the time Command posted me, Keth Soren, and every one of them had a personality if you spent long enough reading the land. Some were indifferent, some were actively hostile in the way that geologies can be hostile. Loose scree, hidden sinkholes, weather that came in off the ocean fast enough to pin a scout flat against a rock wall for 40 hours. The Veth Plateau was none of those things. It was patient. That was the word that kept coming back to me in the first week. Patient in the way that something very old is patient. Not waiting for you specifically. Not waiting for anything in particular. Willing to wait. As long as it took, for whatever was going to happen next to happen. Had 3 weeks to run the forward survey before the main team arrived. Standard advance element protocol. 1 scout, light kit, no exfil window until day 21. The mission was cartographic. The plateau had been flagged by orbital survey as a potential resupply corridor, and someone at command needed ground truth before they committed to infrastructure placement. My job was to walk it. Map the water sources, the load-bearing terrain, the routes that would hold tracked vehicles in all weather conditions. Basic work. I had done it 8 times before on 8 other worlds, and I had always come home. Command took as evidence of competence, and I took as evidence of caution. The plateau itself was extraordinary in the way that landscapes sometimes are when nothing in particular is wrong with them. 2 kilometers above sea level, roughly 400 kilometers across in either direction, flat enough in the central plain that you could see the horizon curving if the light was right. The rock was a compressed sedimentary layer, pale cream and amber, wind-scored smooth in the exposed sections, fractured into deep parallel channels where the underlying strata had shifted and hadn't quite healed. Dry grasses covered most of the open ground, knee-high, the color of old paper, moving constantly in the thermic winds that crossed the plateau surface in the afternoons. There were no trees in the central plain. The scrub growth kept to the channel edges, low and thorny, finding the moisture that collected in the rock fractures. It was a good landscape for a scout. Long sight lines, clear footing on the wind-scoured rock. Minimal cover for anything that might want to come at you without being seen first. So, I thought in the first week. The work was straightforward enough in those first days. The orbital data had given me a solid baseline, elevation gradients, major fracture channels, estimated water table depth in the sedimentary zones. What the orbital data couldn't give me was the ground feel. The way the substrate responded to load, the actual flow behavior of the seeps and fracture water sources. The condition of the rock surface in the sheltered sections where erosion had been slower and the stone was still rough enough to give a wheeled vehicle trouble. Those things require boots. I covered roughly 18 kilometers a day on the flat sections, less when the terrain folded into the deeper channel systems. My log entries were detailed and dull, in the way that good field notes are detailed and dull. Bearing, distance, surface classification, water source assessment, estimated load capacity. The kind of data that builds into something useful slowly, entry by entry, the way a picture resolves out of noise when you have enough of it. I noticed the movement at the edge of day 3. Late afternoon, the light going warm and horizontal across the plateau, throwing long shadows off every ridge and tussock. I had made camp in a shallow depression near a water source, a slow seep out of a rock face, enough to fill 2 canisters over the course of an hour if you were patient about it. I was eating, watching the horizon the way you always watch a horizon when you are the only human within 400 kilometers in any direction, and I saw it. It was not a shape. That is the first thing I have to make clear to anyone who hasn't been in a place like the Veth Plateau, because your brain will try to fit what I am describing into the category of a thing you've seen before, and it will fail. It was not an animal. It was not a weather event. It was not a trick of the light. Although the light on the plateau in the late afternoon was deceptive enough that I spent the first 4 or 5 sightings trying to convince myself that it was. It was a displacement, a sense that the air between 2 points on the ground was slightly different from the air everywhere else, denser or slower, carrying a charge that made my eyes want to fix on it the way eyes fix on movement even when nothing has moved. I sat with my food and I watched it for about 20 minutes. It did not approach. It did not retreat. It simply occupied a position roughly 300 meters to my northwest, and was there in the same way that a very large, still animal is there when it is not concerned about whether you have noticed it. I filed it in my log as anomalous atmospheric phenomenon, ate the rest of my ration, and went to sleep with one hand on my signal kit. It was there the next morning. Different position. 200 meters to the northeast now. Between me and the route I had planned for the day's traverse. Not blocking the route, just present. I altered my heading by 15 degrees, added a notation to the log, and kept moving. The fourth day I saw it 3 times. Once at first light, to the south, where I had not expected it. Once at mid-morning, briefly, near a fracture channel I was mapping. Once at dusk, close enough that I stopped walking and stood still for about a minute before it settled back into the background quality of the air, and I stopped being able to locate it. I wrote 3 lines in my log that night and then deleted them because they didn't say anything useful. What I had observed didn't fit any category in the standard field survey vocabulary. And I had learned early in my career that forcing an observation into an inadequate category was worse than leaving it uncategorized. Unknown, I wrote, recurring, non-threatening to date, monitoring. On day 5 it was close enough that I stopped walking because there was nothing else to do. I had come up the east side of a long ridge line, good high ground, the kind of feature that earns its climb because you can see the whole days from the top. I crested the ridge, and it was there on the other side, not 10 meters away, and I stopped because all my training told me to back down the ridge and put distance between myself and the unknown, and my legs didn't move. Up close, if close is even the right word, for something that did not have a surface in any conventional sense. It was like looking at a column of air that had decided to be slightly opaque. There was mass to it, not the mass of a body, not the mass of anything biological, the mass of compressed geology. The weight of something that had been in one place for a very long time and had gradually become the place. It did not make a sound. There was no communication, no signal, no exchange of any kind that I could identify in that first near encounter. It simply held its position, and I held mine. And after a while my heart rate dropped from the place it had gone when I crested the ridge, and I became aware that I was not afraid. Uneasy, yes, alert certainly, but not afraid. Whatever this thing was, it was not considering me as a threat, or a meal, or an obstacle. It was considering me the way you consider something you have been watching for a while and have already made a decision about, and the decision was, wait. I backed down the ridge. I altered my route again. I kept moving. 6 and 7 I saw the presences. I had begun thinking of them that way, plural, though I was not yet sure if I was dealing with one thing or several. At a consistent distance of roughly 200 to 300 meters. Never closer than that after the ridge encounter. Never far enough that I lost the sense of them entirely. The pattern was clear enough by day 7 that I could map it. They were not shadowing me randomly. They were tracking the specific route I was walking, as though they already knew my waypoints, as though my itinerary was something they had anticipated. I had not broadcast my route. I had planned it each morning from the terrain data, adjusting for what the previous day's ground had taught me. Whatever was tracking me was reading the terrain the same way I was reading it, one step ahead. By day 8, I had accepted that it was going to be there for the duration of the survey. Whatever it was, wherever it came from, it had attached itself to my traverse in a way that was not hostile and was not random. It was deliberate. Stop trying to explain the presences in my logs. The log entries became shorter. Day 8. Present at 04:090, 16:30. Consistent with mine. No interaction. No threat indicators. Continuing traverse. I want to be honest about what the next 6 days felt like, because the easy version of the story skips this part and goes straight to day 14. And skipping it misrepresents what happened. The easy version makes it sound like a straightforward revelation. Strange thing. 40 minutes sitting still. Disc in the palm. Done. The actual experience was nothing like that. The actual experience was 6 more days of moving through high-altitude terrain in the specific company of something I did not understand, while continuing to do precise cartographic work that required my full professional attention. That dual occupation, the work and the awareness of the presences, produced a kind of sustained, low-level alertness that I had not felt since my field postings. Not fear, not quite wonder, not yet. A state of maintained readiness without a clear object. I was ready for something, but I did not know what. I ate my rations. I logged my observations. I took my hourly position readings. And underneath all of that, in whatever part of the attention doesn't fully close down, even when the professional part is fully occupied, I was listening. Not for sound, quality of presence, the variation in it, any signal that the nature of the watching had changed. There were things I tried. On day 9, I spent an hour near one of the fracture channel water sources, a place where the seep from the rock produced a flat shelf of damp silt that should in principle have held any impression. Animal track, pressure mark. Anything physical that might tell me what I was dealing with. There was nothing in the silt except my own boot impressions and the small pitting from the water dripping off the rock face. Whatever the presences were, they did not leave marks. On day 10, I set up my survey equipment at a suspected presence location and ran a full instrument pass. Spectrographic, electromagnetic, acoustic across available frequencies. The equipment found nothing outside of normal geological baseline for the plateau. What I was perceiving did not register on any instrument I had, which did not mean it wasn't there. It meant my instruments were not the right tools for it. On day 11, I stopped trying to measure it and started, instead, simply noting it. The way you note terrain rather than analyzing it in real time, recording not interpreting, where it was in the morning. It was at midday. Whether the quality of it varied with time of day, or with my proximity to different terrain features. I filled 12 pages of my field notebook with these observations over the 4 days between day 11 and day 14, and when I read those pages back later, they told me exactly one thing with any consistency. The presences were most concentrated on the sections of wind-scored bare rock, where the plateau's underlying strata were closest to the surface. As though whatever this was, it was strongest where the ground was thinnest between it and the open air. Changed on day 14 was the quality of the attention. I am a scout. My job is to read terrain and read presence, and the difference between the two is not always as clear as the training manuals suggest. Terrain has memory, old burn lines, water channels that haven't run in decades, compaction patterns in the soil that tell you where something heavy stood for a long time. Presence is terrain that is still happening. The Veth Dur Plateau had both in abundance, and by day 14 I had stopped clearly distinguishing between them. But on day 14, out on the central plain, crossing a section of wind-scoured rock that had nothing on it except the dry grass and the horizontal light, I became aware that the attention had changed. The passive watchfulness that had been there since day 3, the sense of something that had made its decision and was now simply waiting, had shifted into something more active. I was being considered, not appraised, not threatened, considered. The way you consider a path you are thinking of walking, the way you consider a door before you decide whether to open it. I stopped walking. I set down my pack. I sat down on the bare rock in the full noon light, the wind coming in off the plateau from the west, the dry grass hissing around me at the edges of the scoured section. I did not look for the presence. I had stopped trying to locate it visually on about day 10, when I had finally accepted that looking was not the right tool for what I was perceiving. I sat, and I waited, and I let the plateau be whatever it was going to be. This sounds simple when I describe it that way. It was not simple. I was behind schedule. I had lost half a day the previous afternoon when a fracture channel had turned out to run in the wrong direction and I had needed to backtrack 3 kilometers to find a crossing. The mission log had a target coverage area per day, and I was already on the low edge of it. Every professional instinct I had said, keep moving. You can't fall behind on a 21-day window with no exfil flexibility. You don't sit on bare rock in the middle of the day when you have kilometers to cover. But I sat. I have thought about that decision many times since. I don't think it was a brave decision. I don't think it was even a fully conscious one, in the way that decisions usually have a moment of deliberation at their center. It was more like a recognition. Something in the quality of what I was perceiving that morning had the character of an offer. Not a demand, not a beckoning, the particular quality of a door that has been left slightly open to indicate that you may come in if you choose to. I recognized it. I sat down. It took about 40 minutes. I tracked the time on my unit because the mission log required hourly position confirmations, and I did not want to miss a window. I sat. The wind moved the grass. The light moved incrementally around me as the sun tracked across the plateau sky. A deep, washed blue up here above the cloud layer. No haze. The kind of sky that makes everything on the ground look very small and very clear. The presence was there. I could feel the density of it settling around me the way temperature settles. Not suddenly, not with any moment of arrival, just becoming more present the way quiet becomes more present when you stop moving. And then something touched my hand. I need to be precise about this, because I have told the story badly in the past, and the badly told version is interesting in the wrong ways. What I mean when I say something touched my hand is this. There was a contact, lasting perhaps 2 seconds, on the back of my right hand as it rested palm down on the rock beside me. The contact was not warm, it was not cold, it was the specific temperature of the rock I was sitting on, which had been in full sun for several hours, and had the particular warmth of stored heat rather than generated heat. And in the moment of that contact, my hand, without any volition on my part, turned palm up, and the disc was there. It was small. I want to be very precise about the dimensions because the smallness of it is important. Fleek 22 millimeters in diameter, perhaps 4 millimeters thick at the center, tapering toward the edge. It was made of fired clay. I know this because I had it analyzed later, and the analysis confirmed it was a ceramic material consistent with high-temperature firing of a mineral-rich sediment. The color was pale cream with amber flecks, which is exactly the color of the sedimentary rock on the Veth Dur Plateau. It had been worn smooth on both faces by handling, not by my handling, by something's handling. The surface was the particular smoothness of an object that has been picked up and set down and picked up again many thousands of times. Not polished, not machined, just worn into the specific knors of long use. On the face that was pressed against my palm, there was a groove, a single incised line, clean and deliberate, running from the outer edge of the disc to its center. The groove was roughly 1.5 millimeters wide, perhaps 1 millimeter deep. It had been made with a tool, or a pressure, that understood the material it was working in. The edges of the groove were clean and consistent, no variation in width. Someone or something had made that mark, knowing exactly what the material would do under that specific pressure. I sat with it in my open palm for a long time. When I finally looked up, the presence was gone. Not retreated, gone. The plateau was just the plateau. Rock, dry grass, wind, noon light. I was alone in the way I had been alone on day one, except that I was holding a ceramic disc that had not been in my hand 3 minutes ago, and that carried on its face a mark I did not understand. Sat with the disc for the rest of the afternoon. Then I wrapped it in a strip of field dressing, the only clean cloth I had on me, and put it in the inner pocket of my jacket, close to my chest, and finished the day's traverse. I did not see the presence again after that. For the next 7 days, until the main team arrived, I crossed the plateau alone. I finished the cartographic survey. I established the perimeter markers. I compiled the terrain notes into a report that my mission commander would be able to read in under 40 minutes. I did all of this correctly and on schedule, and every morning when I woke up, I checked the inner pocket of my jacket to make sure the disc was still there, and every time it was. The aloneness of those last 7 days was different from the aloneness of the first 14. In the first 14 days, I had been alone in the familiar scout sense. Isolated, self-sufficient, professionally absorbed in the work. After day 14, I was alone in a way I had no prior experience with. I was carrying something that no protocol addressed, something that had come from a form of awareness I could not categorize. And I had no one to talk to about it, and no framework to put it in. I mapped the remaining terrain, I filed my reports, and at night I took the disc out of my jacket pocket and held it and thought about what it was and what it meant, and I came no closer to an answer in 7 days than I had in the first hour after it appeared in my palm. Closest I got was this. Whatever had given me the disc had been watching travelers on the Veth Dur Plateau for long enough that the watching itself had become the thing it was. Not a species with a civilization, not a diplomatic entity with interests to advance, not a predator with territory to defend. Something that had started as whatever it started as, and across a span of time I couldn't properly imagine, had settled into the plateau the way sediment settles, gradually, completely, until the distinction between the thing and the place it occupied had become academic. And this thing, which had watched and had not spoken, and had not intervened for all of that time, had looked at a human scout sitting still in the noon light on bare wind-scoured rock, and had decided, the first time or not the first time, but certainly for the first time, to say something. The disc was what it had to say. That groove was the entire sentence. I thought about what it would cost something that old to construct a sentence, to take the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of watching and compress it into a mark on a coin of pale clay. Not a greeting, no warmth in it, no curiosity about me specifically, no reciprocal interest in where I had come from or where I was going. Just this. Here is the limit of what I know about the territory ahead of you. This is as far as I go. Past this point you are without my guidance, and I am telling you this so that you can hold it. I did not tell anyone about the disc until the team had been on the ground for 4 days. I did not know how to begin to explain it, and the honest reason for that is not that it was strange. Strange things happen on survey worlds. That is why they send scouts before they send teams. But that I did not yet understand what it was, and I was not willing to offer something up for other people to explain before I understood it myself. Or as much of it as I was going to understand. The team geologist was the first person I told. Not because she was the obvious choice, because on the 4th evening, she sat down next to me at the camp table after dinner and asked what I had found interesting about the plateau. And the question was phrased in the specific way that means the person asking it has already noticed that you are carrying something and is giving you a reasonable route to set it down. She had been on the plateau for 4 days by then. She had taken her own readings in the central plain, run her own instrument passes through the exposed sedimentary sections, and she had her own set of observations. She had not yet committed to a report. I found out later she had been waiting to see whether anyone else on the team had noticed the same thing she had before she put them in writing. When I took out the disc, I understood why she had waited. I showed her the disc. She turned it over in her hands for a long time. She was a careful person, Naledi Oferwuche. I had worked with her on 2 previous surveys, and I trusted her professional judgment in the way that, Chench, you trust the judgment of someone who has been wrong at exactly the right moments, and learned from it rather than defending themselves. She turned the disc over, looked at the groove, pressed her thumb along its path from the edge to the center. This is fired local sediment, she said. The mineral composition matches the plateau bedrock almost exactly. I told her I had suspected as much. How old is it? I told her I didn't know. I told her I hadn't had the equipment to date it in the field. She set it down on the table between us. We both looked at it. The camp lantern was behind us, and in its light the disc threw a small, precise shadow. The groove's edge catching the light and holding it in a line from the rim to the center. Tell me exactly what you observed, she said. I told her everything. The presences beginning on day 3, the way they had tracked my traverse, the quality shift on day 14, 40 minutes of sitting still, the contact, the disc in my open palm. Naledi did not interrupt me. She was the kind of person who let you finish. When I had finished, she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Do you know what a trail end marker is?" I told her I did. Cartographic, a physical notation placed at the terminus of a mapped route to indicate that the route did not continue beyond that point, that the mapmaker had reached the limit of their knowledge and was marking it honestly. Used in a dozen different cartographic traditions across human history, in various forms, cairns, blazed trees, cut marks in stone. The practice was old and practical and had nothing to recommend it beyond the fact that, that groove, she said, is a trail end mark. She wasn't speaking about human cartography. She was speaking about the groove in the disc. She was saying, this is the mark a cartographer makes when they have reached the edge of the territory they are willing to guide you through. I picked up the disc again and pressed my thumb along the groove the way she had. From the edge to the center, end of the route, this far, no further. Not a warning, not a boundary, a form of honesty, the most fundamental act of cartographic courtesy. Here is where I stop knowing. And I am telling you that I stop knowing here so that you can be prepared. I held the disc and thought about what it would take to make that mark. Not the physical act of pressing a tool into clay, that was simple enough. The other thing, the decision behind it. To have watched 1,000 different kinds of travelers cross your territory. To have watched some of them die in the places where your knowledge ended, and yours did not extend. To have watched this for long enough that watching had become the condition of your existence, and then to have looked at one particular traveler, sitting still on the rock in the noon light, and made a different decision. Something on this plateau has been mapping it for a very long time, Naledi said. I told her I thought that was right, and it decided to share with you the limit of what it knows. I told her I thought that was what the disc meant, or part of what it meant. How long do you think it's been here? I told her I didn't know. I told her the plateau geology was old. The sedimentary layers and the exposed fractures had been laid down over millions of years. But the entity itself, if it was an entity, if that was even the right word for something that seemed more like a property of the place than a thing, within it, I couldn't say. Naledi thought about it. She had the geologist habit of working from evidence to minimum ranges rather than from speculation to preferred answers, and she applied it now. She worked through what she knew about the rate of mineralization on Kethsoren, the estimated age of the plateau formation, the documented cases, handful that there were, of substrate distributed intelligence on other surveys. She didn't speak while she was working through it. I waited. 10,000 years, she said finally. Not as a number she had calculated, as a floor. The minimum that the evidence supported, given what she knew about how intelligence distributes itself in long, stable geological formations. She had read the relevant literature. There was a small body of it, speculative, contested, populated by researchers who had found patterns in mineral formations on survey worlds that they couldn't explain by physical processes alone. She had read it the way careful scientists read contested literature, with interest and without commitment. But she had read it, and the floor she was giving me was not a guess. At minimum, she said, probably considerably longer. We sat with that for a while. The camp was quiet around us. Through the tent fabric, I could hear the wind on the plateau, the same wind that had been there all 3 weeks, moving the dry grass in the darkness. The mission commander, when I eventually showed him the disc on day 6 of the team's presence on the plateau, filed a report to command and requested a xenological assessment team. Command responded in 12 days with a standard acknowledgement and a request, additional documentation. The documentation request asked for, among other things, the GPS coordinates of the contact event, a description of an exchange of language or signal, and an estimate of the subject entity's physical dimensions. Filed back a set of GPS coordinates that identified a section of wind-scored rock on the central plain approximately 400 meters across. I noted that no language or signal exchange had occurred in any form that my equipment had registered, or that I could characterize using standard contact terminology with the exception of the physical transfer of the object. For the physical dimensions question, I wrote, distributed, possibly the plateau, assessment requested. The xenological team arrived 3 months after I left Kethsoren. I know because Naledi messaged me when they landed. They found no further contact events during their 8-week assessment period. Presences did not reappear. Their report, which I read in summary form when it was cleared 18 months later, concluded that the contact event I had described was consistent with documented patterns of intelligent geological substrate behavior on 3 other survey worlds and was plausible but unconfirmed. They recommended continued monitoring and a moratorium on infrastructure development in the central plateau sector until the nature of the contact could be further assessed. The infrastructure moratorium is still in place as of the last time I checked. I don't know what to make of that, except that it seems correct. Some places are not ours to build on until we understand what is already there. The plateau was there before we arrived, and whatever had been watching from within it had been doing so through longer stretches of time than any human institution has existed, and it had offered Once one small act of guidance to one scout who sat still long enough to receive it. The least we could do was not put a loading dock on top of it, while we were still trying to understand what had happened. I kept the disc. I want to be clear that I did not keep it as a souvenir. I am not much for souvenirs. I have moved enough times in 30 years of fieldwork that I have learned not to carry things for sentiment alone. I kept it because I did not know what else to do with it, and because every time I tried to imagine setting it down somewhere, on a shelf in quarters, in a storage box, in the xenological evidence lockup that Command wanted me to put it in, and that I declined, citing personal possession and the absence of any formal acquisition protocol, it felt wrong. Not wrong in a mystical sense. Wrong in the sense of an action that mismatches its object. The disc had been pressed into my hand because I had been the one sitting still. It was mine in the specific way that trust is given and received, not transferable to an institution, not archivable, not something that became more understandable under laboratory conditions. It belonged to the relationship that had generated it, and I was the other party in that relationship. And for as long as I carried it, the relationship remained, live in some way that I could not have defended in a report, but that I was certain of. So I kept it, in my inner jacket pocket for the first year. Then in a small flat case on my desk. I had a desk by then, a semi-permanent posting at a forward survey station in the Chemveth sector. And a desk meant something after the years of moving. The case was nothing special. Pressed card, the kind that field kit arrives in. The disc sat in it on the desk of every posting I held for the next 29 years, which was 7 postings in 6 different sectors. It went into the pocket when I went into the field, and came back to the case when I came back to the desk, and in that rhythm, it became as ordinary as any other piece of kit, except that its purpose was different from any other piece of kit I had ever carried. I looked at it often. Not every day, but often. Nights after surveys when the weight of what I had been looking at all day, the indifference of new terrain, the particular loneliness of being the first human to see something, needed somewhere to settle, I would pick up the disc and press my thumb along the groove and think about the thing it had come from. And the thinking was not always comfortable. It was always useful. What I kept coming back to was this. The disc was not a gift in the way that gifts are usually understood. It was not generosity in the warm human sense of that word. The sense that involves wanting something good for the recipient, kind of forward-looking warmth. It was something older and more practical. It was the thing you do when you have watched travelers come through your territory for 10,000 years. And you have watched some of them go confidently past the edge of what you know into the territory you cannot see. And you have watched what happened to some of them in that territory. And you are not able to speak to them in any way they will understand. And you cannot go with them. And you cannot stop them. But you can put something in their hand that says, "This is where I stop. Past this point I cannot help you. Know that. It is a small thing to do. It is the smallest possible thing you can do. But it is not nothing." I thought about this often enough over the years that it began to change how I worked. Not dramatically. I did not become a different kind of scout overnight, and I would be suspicious of anyone who claimed that a single experience, however unusual, transformed their professional practice completely. What I became, I think, was slightly more honest about the edges of my own knowledge. Not in my formal reports, which had always been precise, but in the informal guidance I gave to the scouts I was training by the time I had been doing this long enough to be asked to train people. In the pre-mission briefings, in the debriefs, in the conversations that happen over food after a hard traverse, when someone is trying to make sense of something they've encountered and can't fit into any category the training covered. The habit among experienced scouts, I had practiced it myself, is to project confidence in briefings. Not to lie about unknowns, exactly, but not to name them either. To give people what they need to function and hold back what might make them hesitate. There is a version of this that is good mentorship. Protecting a new scout from paralysis by uncertainty until they have enough experience. Carry uncertainty without freezing. But there is another version of it that is something else. A kind of professional vanity, a reluctance to admit the edge of your knowledge because admitting it makes you seem less authoritative. I had been guilty of the second version more than I'd admitted to myself. The disc, and the patient thing that had made it and pressed it into my palm had made that harder to sustain. Here was an intelligence that had been watching travelers longer than any human institution had existed, that had more accumulated experience of the terrain I was working than I could conceive of. And it had not pretended its knowledge was unlimited. It had marked the edge honestly. It had told me, this far, and not further, and the telling was the thing. I started saying, instead, here is what I know. Here is the edge of what I know. Past that edge, you are on your own. And I am telling you this so that you can be prepared. It is a small adjustment. I cannot claim it saved anyone's life directly, though I think it may have, in the way that the small adjustments in preparation sometimes mean the difference between a scout who recognizes they have passed the edge of no sense, and one who keeps pushing on momentum into territory they are not equipped for. What I can claim is that the scouts I trained were marginally better at reading the moment when they had passed the edge, because they had been told that such a moment exists, and that it has a character you can recognize if you have been told what to look for, and that the right response to it is not to push through it, but to stop and take stock and make a deliberate decision about whether you might have enough. Continue. I retired from active field survey 17 years ago. I have been doing assessment and training work since then. Desk work, mostly. Field visits, when the mission requires a senior evaluation. The disc has been in the breast pocket of the uniform jacket I wear on evaluation. Visits for most of that time. Not a superstition, a practice. 3 weeks ago I handed a deployment order to a scout named Arvid Sarin. Young, 24. Which is not as young as it seems when you have been doing this long enough. Good field instincts. The specific kind of quiet that survey work requires, which is not the absence of curiosity, but the ability to hold curiosity without being driven by it. To observe without the observation tipping into the need for an immediate answer. I had watched him work for 8 months in training postings and on 2 subordinates' survey rotations. I had concluded that he was the kind of person who could sit still on bare rock for 40 minutes in the noon light if the situation called for. Keth Soren is not his posting. His posting is a world called Yethmakar, a high plateau environment with some geological characteristics that the orbital survey had flagged as worth a second look. Deep sedimentary compression, long stable strata, fracture channel hydrology, consistent with mineral-rich water concentration at depth. I had sent the preliminary orbital scans to Naledi, who had retired from active survey work 2 years ago, but still read the data when I sent it to her. Her annotation had come back in 12 words. Interesting parallel to Veth Dur substrate signature. Worth a careful approach. I gave Sarin the standard briefing: terrain, objectives, protocol, exfil window. I went through the checklist the way I always go through it, which is thoroughly and without shortcuts. Because shortcuts in briefings are how you lose scouts, who don't yet know what questions they should be asking. I told him about the geological features. I told him what the orbital data supported and what it didn't. I told him the areas of highest uncertainty, the places where the ground truth was likely to depart most from the model, the conditions under which he was authorized to alter his route, and the conditions under which he needed to hold it regardless. Then I told him about the Veth Dur Plateau. I told it the way I have learned to tell it over the years, which is factually and without editorializing, because the facts are sufficient and editorializing is what you do when you don't trust the facts to carry their own weight. Day 3, Day 5 on the ridge, the quality shift on Day 14, the decision to sit still, the 40 minutes, the contact, the disc in my open palm. He listened the way a good scout listens. Fully. Without the half-presence that means someone is already constructing their response, while you're still talking. When I had finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does the groove mean?" I told him. Trail end mark. Graphic notation. This is as far as we go together. He looked at the disc for a while longer. I let him look. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. I told him that the Yethmakar orbital scans had the same signatures the Veth Dur Plateau had before I arrived. I told him this might mean nothing, that orbital data produces false correlations regularly, that Naledi's annotation, Was a single scientist read on limited data that he might spend 21 days on Yethmakar and come home with clean terrain data and no anomalous atmospheric phenomena whatsoever, which would be a successful survey and a good outcome. I told him it might mean something else, and if it meant something else, the most important thing he could do was not what most scouts would do in his position. The most important thing he could do was sit still. Not run, I said, not press forward, not try to locate it or signal it or classify it. Sit still. Give whatever it is the time to make its own decision. The decision will not be about you specifically. Nothing in my experience of the Veth-Dur contact suggested it was interested in me as an individual. It will be about whether a particular kind of traveler, at a particular moment, is the kind of traveler worth talking to. He asked what kind of traveler that was. I told him I thought it was a traveler who could be still, could hold a moment without trying to own it, or explain it, or make it into something that fit a form. He nodded. He was turning it over in his mind, I could tell. Not skeptically, not reverently, just looking at it carefully the way he looked at everything. I told him one more thing. I told him that the disc had been in my possession for 30 years, and that in 30 years I had never found a better use for it than this one, putting it on the table in front of someone who was about to go somewhere I could not go with them. So they would know that there are intelligences in this galaxy that have been watching longer than we have been looking, and that some of them, some conditions will tell you honestly where their knowledge ends, and that honesty, offered from something that old, in a form that's small, into an open palm without ceremony on a section of bare rock in the noon light, is the rarest thing any scout will ever receive. I picked up the disc. I pressed it into his palm. He held it, feeling the weight of it. Small, as I said, the weight of a coin, the weight of a smooth piece of plateau sediment that has been handled for a very long time by something I never saw clearly and will never fully understand. He ran his thumb along the groove the way Naledi had, the way I had done 10,000 times over 30 years in the quiet at the end of a long day. From the edge to the center, he looked up at me, told him to bring it back if he could. I told him that if circumstances made that impossible, if the survey went wrong in the ways surveys sometimes go wrong, and he needed to put something down to have both hands free, then the disc was less important than the lesson, and the lesson was, know the edge of what you know, name it, and stop before you cross it without preparation. He said he understood. He ships out in 4 days. I will not go with him. I cannot go with him. That is the condition of this work at my stage of it. Prepare people for places you can no longer go. And you send them and you wait for them to come back and tell you what they found. I have been a scout for most of my adult life, and I have been to more places than I can easily count, and I have made more terrain maps than I could fit in this room. I know a great deal about a large number of worlds. I also know, with more precision than I once did, exactly where my knowledge ends. I know the shape of that edge, and I know how to name it, and I know that naming, it is not failure. It is the most honest thing a guide can do. The Veth-Dur Plateau taught me that. Not the terrain of it, not the cartographic data I gathered across those 21 days, not the mission report that Command archived and the xenological team used as baseline documentation. The disc taught me that. 10,000 years of patience, at minimum Naledi had said, probably considerably longer. Pressing a trail-end mark into the palm of the first traveler who sat still long enough to receive it. Arvid Saren is carrying it now. I hope he brings it back. I hope more than that he sits still on Yeth-Sakar for 40 minutes in the noon light on a high section of wind-scored rock, and that whatever is watching out there, if anything is watching, if the correlation in the orbital data is more than a false positive, decide that he is the kind of traveler worth talking to. If it does, he will know what it means. He will know because I told him, and because the disc in his pocket says it more clearly than any briefing ever could. This is as far as we go together. Past here, you are on your own, and we are telling you this so that you can be prepared. It is a small thing, the smallest possible thing. It is not nothing.